Good morning, everyone. Today we have this is Miss Kylie Vandiver that sent us this nice background. So thank you for that. I know you sent it last week, hoping to get it on election day, but I'm sorry I had a queue at the time, so Snoopy had to wait. But I think we all can always use a little bit of that. So thank you for that. And as you said, indeed, Thanksgiving is coming pretty soon, so we're looking forward for that as well. A couple of things before we start. Let me place the slides anyway on the screen and then I can start talking. Starting from tomorrow, you should be able to start submitting course evaluations. So I would really appreciate if you, at some point over the next, I think it's from the 11th until the 20th or even until the end of the month, you can go on the system and provide some feedback on this course. I'll be very happy to see what you think about the class. So that's going to be great. Thank you in advance for that. If you have more questions, you need help regarding your final project, please do not hesitate to contact me. We can do that through email, but as you can see, it takes me a little longer to respond, and I don't want to engage in 400 or 500 word emails to answer your specific questions. So it's better to just come and talk to me during office hours. And that's what we have just for today. We'll start talking this week about international terrorism, and I just want to give you prepare you beforehand. It may be that the slide's going to be a little bit heavy in terms of text for this week, and I'm sorry about that, but I just really wanted you to get a lot of the information in. So that's one thing that I just wanted to warn you in advance. Okay, before we start today's topic, let's do a quick review on Thursday's meeting. I finished a discussion about territorial disputes, mostly talking about the different motivations. So I began by showing you some of the political prices, the political price that governments can pay for engaging in territorial wars, with the example from Israel. Despite the fact that Israel won the war from a military standpoint, the government still paid a price, and actually 4 years later, the government actually lost its position. And then we talked a little bit more about really motivations and explanations for why territories are such an important issue, which leads later to disputes and wars, and taking the Johnson and Tuft, which provide us with evolutionary approach to terrorism. It provides us both rational aspects of this evolutionary approach, the way that animals view territory, as well as beyond that. Why do we feel such a strong attachment to a homeland or to some piece of land, and how that may lead to a violent behavior. Then I mentioned then we talked about the aspect of historical ownership, which relate on some level to this homeland aspect. The examples from China and the research, which showed that when the issue of historical ownership was raised in that survey that they ran there, then the level of support for compromise or for any kind of concessions was much lower. So once the issue is viewed also as I'm the historical owner of that land, and the attachment to the land is a lot more powerful, and the possibility of compromise is lower. Also, with the study of Japan, that was ran in Japan, talked about spatial proximity. Those who are closer to the area in disputes are actually more likely to favor a settlement, because then they will not pay any kind of price for that, compared to those who are far away, and they should think more about the political aspect of it. And lastly, I gave you some evidence from the research also conducted in Israel regarding the tangible and intangible values of territory, and how that may lead to some sort of a compromise. And that was tasted, of course, with the Israeli public. So there's a lot of issues in that lecture. And if you have any questions, of course, you are more than welcome to talk to me about that. So this week's topic is international terrorism. We will start that today talking about conceptual issues, trying to explain what is terrorism, why is this an important topic to study. And then we'll take sort of a theoretical journey explaining the motivations for terrorism, and explaining why do individuals engage in those kinds of acts, and why do they support those kinds of acts. That's going to be today, and on Thursday we'll talk about the second part of it, trying to finish this discussion and give you a real more of a comprehensive view about international terrorism, motivations, effects, and those kinds of things. So the first issue we address is whether terrorism is actually that much of a threat. What you have here is data from one of the most extensive databases of terrorism incidents throughout the world. It's called the GTD dataset. It is housed at the University of Maryland, where they have a very big and important research center when it comes to terrorism. And what we see here is that despite the fact that terrorism is relatively prevalent when it comes to news reporting, events are not very frequent. So the data runs through 2018, and the last 2 years of the data, when it comes to attacks or incidents in the United States, the total number of incidents in the US, according to the data set, is 133. But the vast majority of those attacks, of those 133 attacks, are actually what's described as a domestic, any kind of white supremacist groups, according to their definition of that. And we'll get to definition in a few minutes. And only 7 incidents actually fit to what we view as terror attacks by foreign groups or foreign individuals. For those incidents, there was a total of 15 fatalities and 25 injured. And most of those casualties came from a single attack in October 2017, when a car was rammed itself into a tourist in New York City, ending in 8 fatalities and 13 injuries. 2 of them are American citizens, for that matter. So overall, not a very high number. If you look at this data, also looking a little bit back in time, 2012, there's a small number, 2007, a very small number. So when we consider this data and the size of the American population, the actual risk for being a victim of terrorism incident is very, very small, maybe even an insignificant one. And that led, at some point, in some sense, to this kind of quote by Mueller, who is an expert on issues of conflict and terrorism. And he provided that specific quote on 2006, which in that time, terrorism was a much more prevalent topic, even in the public debate. And he suggests here that if the terror operators are that determined and inventive, they should already be here by now, right? That's kind of the result after everything that happened in 9/11. And if they're not here, then either they're not very good at it or they don't really care that much. Again, all of that speaks to maybe the threat of terrorism is not as big as the way it was perceived by the media outlets and the government and the public at the time. Let's look at a little bit more data to think about it a little bit more. So this is from a textbook that I'm usually using when I'm teaching this class. And what you see here in this table is the likelihood of being a victim of any kind of causes of death in the US. And that's how much more likely it is, how many times more you're more likely to die of those kinds of causes compared to terrorism. So for example, you're 35,000 times more likely to die from a heart disease than from being a victim of terrorism, which in a way makes sense because a lot of people unfortunately suffer from those kinds of medical health problems. But in an advanced democracy such as the United States, you are a little less than 200 times more likely to die because of starvation than dying because you were a victim of a terrorism incident. Again, suggesting then this is not too much of a threat to us as a public who lives here in the United States. This figure, on the x-axis we have here time series over time, and we have 2 upper axes here. We have the number of incidents and the percentage of incidents that are directed at the US interest per year across the world. And what we see here, that there's over time, there's a lower number of attacks and a lower percentage of those attacks against US assets. Even within this data, very few of the attacks are actually within the United States border. And most of the attacks that you see in those figures are attacks against American assets in foreign countries. And one of the explanations for this trend in the data is that the American government has emphasized various US Homeland Security policies that strengthened the American Homeland Security in that sense, and that led the terrorists not to stop targeting American assets, but to keep targeting American assets, but do that in a less fortified places, so not in the United States territory. Now, overall, what all this data that talked about so far is showing us, especially in the American context, is it leads us to wonder why should we even care about this phenomenon? Even more than that, if we think about that from our perspective for this course, from a research standpoint, why do we need to study that? Why do we need to, in the sense of developing theories that explain such a rare event? And why do we need to spend so much time collect data, test the data, and find conclusions of this data? So I got a couple of answers for that. First, terrorism kills, and the extent of attacks overall increase. It is a political tactic that kills a lot of people, causes a significant number of physical injuries and traumatic experiences. What we see here is the increase in the number of attacks all over the world over time. So maybe there are less attacks in the United States or in Western Europe, but the number of attacks across the world only increase over time. Even more problematic than that is that this is the data about, you can see here, if you look at the y-axis, is the number of fatalities, which means this is the extent of lethality for these attacks. So not only are attacks increase over time, they're creating a lot more casualties over time. In 2012 alone, the Taliban was responsible for killing about 2,000 people. So a lot more people are victims of terrorism. So that's already by itself some cause for why should we care about that, and also why should we study that. Another reason, terrorism is not a United States phenomenon, it's not a Western phenomenon, it's prevalent across the entire globe. These are pie charts which provide us the distribution of transnational terrorism incidents by different regions. So the chart here on the left shows the incidents from 1968 to 2001, and here we have the 2002 until 2016, which is data for that specific article. But we can see here, for example, LAC here is Latin America. 21% of the incidents during that year were in Latin America. That has dropped all the way to about 3%. But on the other hand, SA stands for South Asia. That increased from 4% to about 20%, which is a very significant increase. MENA, which stands for Middle East and North Africa, has doubled in its proportion from 70% of the incidents during that time to over 35% of incidents in the 21st century, which again suggests and provides us with evidence to those shift in the location of the vast majority of attacks. Another reason, terrorism are tragic events which are providing with very negative and tragic experience for those who are the victims of terrorism or beyond that. And that should provide motivation for us as citizens, provide motivation for us as scholars to push for different policies, to push the government to decrease those kinds of events. Those pictures, some of them are very familiar to you, some of them are not. All of you are probably familiar with 9/11, right? You may say, well, 9/11 was almost 20 years ago, so today is not that much of a threat. Well, okay, but this is the events in Boston in April 2013. That wasn't that long ago. Terrorism took place in the US, a lot less, true, but still. This is a picture from a very common picture, unfortunately, from the days of the Second Intifada in the early 2000s in Israel, when hundreds of civilians and military personnel, for that matter, were victims of terrorism. Now, as I said, this is not just a Western phenomenon. This is a funeral of children in Pakistan after Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, I'm sorry, not Al-Qaeda, executed a terror operation in a school and killed over 120 children in late 2017. So this is victims all over the world, which makes this issue a lot more important. Finally, we, the public, care about it. This is a Gallup poll from 2018 here in the United States, and international terrorism is one of the top issues that the public cares about in that aspect. A survey that was conducted by Pew, which was conducted in 2007, it was more of a global type of survey, looked at many different countries, and within those countries, terrorism remained, or was at the time, one of the central issues that the public cared about. So the public cares about that. That's another reason for us to study and to care about this issue. So this is kind of a baseline introduction into the topic of terrorism and why do we even need to care about, even though this is a very rare event. Now, I want to shift gears and talk a little bit more about the research perspective of it and ask, what is terrorism? Why do we need to define this concept? Mainly because from a research standpoint, if we want to conduct a systematic study of this topic, only by having a definition, we can compare between cases within the data that we have. And we can infer some conclusions about those cases. Also, from a policy standpoint, if we don't have clear definition of what kind of incidents fit to an event of terrorism, what kind of policy responses we're going to have to those kinds of incidents, and how do we get some consistency in our counterterrorism policy? I'll talk a lot more about counterterrorism policy on Thursday, but this is just basics understanding of why do we need a definition. The problem is that this is a very complex concept to define. What you have here is parts of argument, statement, and I kept this part on purpose, showing you whoever stands by a just cause fights for the freedom and liberation of his land from invaders. The beginning of this sentence talks about the difference between a terrorist and a freedom fighter, which I'm sure you're familiar with this kind of people invoking this comparison. And according to this kind of view of terrorism or definition of terrorism, as long as those that fight have a just cause and this is the liberation of their land, they're not terrorists. Now, if you were in class now, I would have made a kind of a survey and asked you, who do you think made this kind of proclamation? Now, we're not in class, so I'm going to have to answer it myself, unfortunately. But this is the words of Yasser Arafat, the former head of the Palestinian Authority and the head of the PLO, the Palestinian the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was a terror organization operated in the territories in Israel at the time. So according to his view, as long as the cause is justified, then this is not terrorism. And this just provides us a hint to the challenge of defining this kind of phenomenon. What I want to do now is talk to you about some of the official definitions. And for that, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to take a book here with me because I didn't want to overload the slides with text. So for example, there are some definitions by official organizations, such as the UN, which focus on the outcome. So according to the UN, sorry, there it is. Terrorism is any person that commits an offense which causes death or serious bodily injury, serious damage to public or private property, including the place of public use, a state or government facility. So the UN definition of terrorism focuses on the outcome. Another example is the definitions by the DOD or the American DOJ, the Department of Justice. So according to the definition of terrorism by the Department of Justice or the FBI, international terrorism activities within three characteristics: involve violent acts dangerous to human lives, appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce civilian population, influence a policy, and third is occur primarily outside the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. So this is more focusing on the objectives or the motive of the attackers. The third one I have here is the Saudi Arabian Penal Law, which was instituted in 2014, intended to fight terrorism and financing of terrorism. And I'm not going to give you the entire law because it's a very long one, but I'm just going to give you some of the main points that they raise here. It's any act carried out by an offender in furtherance of an individual or collective project, directly or indirectly, intended to disturb the public order of the state or to shake the security of society or the stability of the state. And there's a lot more than that. I don't want to talk for like 5 minutes just on this law. But the language between those definitions vary. But in each of them, it's important to think about the implications of those kinds of definitions. So if we take the Saudi case, for example, again, we had here, sorry, I'll get back to it just for a second. We had here any act carried out by an offender, directly or indirectly. So what we see in this language that the Saudis have used is there's a lot more freedom for the Saudi government to apprehend or to charge or to arrest suspects in those kinds of actions that they view as terrorism. We may not view many of those acts as terrorism. So this is where definitions matters a lot. Despite those differences, one of the most common elements is what's viewed here as the adoption of irregular means to accomplish political objectives. So this is in terms of general or more of a definitions by governments or international organizations. One of the problems of overall debates about defining terrorism or interpreting events as terrorism is a lot of the interpretation of terrorism places a lot of value on the legitimacy of the act, right? I remind you again, the part of the quote that I had on the slide from Arafat, which talked about a just cause. The problem with legitimacy is that this is a highly subjective and inconsistent concept. What I view as legitimate may not be what others view as legitimate. Because it's a contested element, if we think about it from a scientific standpoint, a scientific approach to study terrorism cannot use this aspect because it complicates the analysis, it makes comparison on cases very hard, it complicates collection of data, scope conditions. Where does legitimacy end? Does shooting somebody who goes into my property is legitimate, but going to outside and chasing him after he ran away and then shooting him, it's still legitimate or not? That creates a problem. If we use, I'll give you as an example from a scientific standpoint, of a research standpoint. One scientist thinks that some act is legitimate. So in that case, if this is a legitimate act and we follow a definition of terrorism as also including legitimate aspect, that means that for that scientist, we call it scientist A, the case that we're talking about is not going to be part of the data, part of the research. But scientist B, in this case, disagrees and see that act that I just talked about as illegitimate. So scientist B will include that case in her data set. How can we compare the findings of those two studies? So in order to avoid from those kinds of obstacles, scholars tend to focus their definitions on much more clear and objective aspects of terrorism. And that's what I want to talk about now. So there are 5 characteristics of terrorism according to a scholarly definition. And why do we use these 5? Mostly because they're objective types of factors or characteristics, and they can be observed, unlike legitimacy, which cannot be observed. So let's go over them. The first is existence of violence. It's very, very simple. There's not much to talk about it. Second is perpetrators. The focus for scholars is non-state actors. The perpetrators of terrorism is non-state actors, which on some level does create a problem, because what about state-sanctioned violence? What about violence promoted by Egypt or against its population, by the Egyptian government against the population, again by the Iranian government against the population? What about violence promoted by the American government against its own population? That creates a problem and controversy, of course. A third point here is targets. The focus is usually on what's called targets who are non-combatants, citizens, members of the public, whatever you want to call them, members of the media, every one of us students walking around the campus here. But I'll get you another complication in this case. What about uniformed military personnel who are not in a combat settings? What if an individual comes back, a Marine officer comes back from deployment, he just comes off the train in New York City and he's being stabbed by some perpetrator and unfortunately dies? Is this terrorism or not? That's a problematic one. I give you a more, this is the hypothetical case, even though it's kind of has some aspects of being realistic. I give you a real case. In 2017, 4 Israeli military soldiers were killed in an attack by a terrorist who used a truck to run over them. And they were not in a combat setting. They were standing in a bus stop waiting to take a bus and go home for their weekend vacation. But they were wearing uniforms. So is this terrorism? Is it not terrorism? That's a complicated one. The last 2 aspects are a very important one, creating those negative psychological effects, fear, anger, anxiety. And the idea behind that is those psychological effects should not be just for the direct victim of the attack, but targeting the wider audience. So if the attack that I just gave you, the hypothetical example of some perpetrator attacking a Marine officer in New York City, the idea is not just to create those effects within the immediate direct victims, but everyone around it and across the United States. Finally, a terror incident has an explicit political objective. The removal of government, the fight over territory, whatever the political objective is. And this is a very crucial feature when you talk about defining terrorism, because that allows us to distinguish between a terrorist act and an act of violence which better fits a crime. So if that individual which stabbed the Marine officer did not have an explicit political objective, maybe he was just trying to rob his cash because he needed money. But if he had explicit political objective, then that incident fits better to a terrorism incident. One accepted scholar definition of terrorism, and that's the one from the textbook that I used, is this one by Chenoweth and Moore from a couple of years ago. And if you follow that specific definition, you can see that each one of those 5 characteristics is actually present in this definition. So this is just an example. And this just to show you how complicated this whole point is. The last group I want to talk about when I talk about defining terrorism is the public. Why does it matter what the public cares about terrorism? First of all, the public is the main target of terrorism. So we should care about what the public thinks. Also, the way that the public views incidents shape what they see as terrorism, what kind of incidents in terrorism, yes or no. And that has an effect on the policy. I've talked about the effect that the public opinion has on policy overall. So to explore that, I want to talk about the work by Huff and Kurtzer from a couple of years ago. They suggest that the public definitions of terrorism rely on two categories or two paths. The first is the objective one, which fits better to what scholars and governments do. This is what they call the facts on the ground. This is the immediate type of information, which is a lot more descriptive, such as the method that was used, the severity of the attack, the target, whether they're civilians or not. This is the objective category. The second category is more specific to the public, and this is a more subjective nature, the why and the who. It focuses on the actor, the motivation of the actor, the goal of the actor. This information usually indirect, and it's not immediate. It may take some time until we learn about the motivation of the perpetrator. Also, this information can be a function of what source we use to collect this information, because the way that an incident is reported by Fox News can be very different from the way it is reported by MSNBC and the way it's reported by Al Jazeera TV, right? So our source of information also matters for this. This is why it's a lot more subjective. Now, they suggest that those are the two categories, and they used a method that I've already talked about a couple of times over the last couple of weeks, the conjoint experiment. They recruit a sample of respondents to their experiment, and they provide them with different scenarios, different incidents, and they vary those kinds of factors. So the methods be used, the motivation for those perpetrators, the type of perpetrators, and they test which one of those factors matter more in the way that the respondents from their survey define the incidents as terrorism, yes or no. So let's just have a quick look on some of the results. I'm not going to go over all of them. So if we begin with the objective category, so this is, for example, the method. And again, just to get you a sense of what these figures suggest, this is what's called the marginal effect of each one of those values. And we always begin with the one who stands here on the 0, because this is what's called the reference category. We always compare the other values to this value. So compared to a tactic of protest, the use of hostage taking or shooting or bombing is much more likely to be viewed as terrorism. So for that matter, if we look again, because the values are positive, that means it's more likely to be viewed as terrorism. If the values are negative, then it's less likely. But in this case, what we can say here is that an incident which involves bombing is the one most likely to be viewed as terrorism. It's pretty simple, right? Another objective element is the perpetrator. Compared to an individual, if that's an individual who has some kind of a mental issues, then the effect here, as you can see, this is a negative values, it's a negative effect. So it doesn't, the respondents in that survey does not view it as terrorism. On the other hand, groups or organizations are much more likely to be viewed. Attacks by those kinds of perpetrators are more likely to be viewed as terrorism. And if it's an organization which has foreign ties, then that effect is even more powerful. Finally, let's talk about the subjective category. And here we have two types of factor. First is the ideology, and I'm going to talk about ideology later today. But compared to having no ideology, a Muslim ideology or a right-wing ideology are much more powerful in this case. So if a perpetrator has a Muslim or right-wing ideology, it's much more likely to be viewed as terrorism. Even left-wing ideology here fits terrorism views. And again, the differences here are not pretty much significant because those confidence intervals overlap, but we see that compared to no ideology, those are much more powerful. Finally, in terms of what they call motive attribution, which is the objective of the attack, compared to a personal dispute, if it's a policy change or if it's government overthrow, which are more explicit political objectives, this is viewed as terrorism. The last one I want to talk about is this one, which is hatred. And that's very distinctive for the public. Part of the motivation, according to the public view of terrorism, is hatred. If I hate someone very much and I engage in, let's go back to their example. In their scenarios, the one they showed to their public, if the motivation was hatred for the victims, then that is viewed as terrorism, which is very, very different from the official definitions of terrorism based on, I talked about the DOD or the DOJ or the UN, or the definitions that scholars have provided. The public adds a lot more emphasis on this subjective aspect, and that's what makes it different. All right, so that was a pretty long discussion about kind of an introduction into why should we care about terrorism, and now talking about the definition, which is still a very controversial topic. And now that we understand that a little bit more, I want to move the discussion to the topic of the causes of terrorism. The way that we're going to do that is that I'm going to use different theoretical approaches to explain the motivation for terrorism, why to join terrorism, why to support terrorism. I'll begin for each one of those approaches with providing you with some context about explaining what they are. And then we're going to talk about the assumptions of those approaches, reminding you again the importance that assumptions play as the building blocks of those theoretical explanations. Then what are the implications based on those assumptions? What do those assumptions lead us to expect in terms of the terrorism aspect? And finally, I'll talk about also criticism. What are the problems in those different approaches? All right, so the first approach is what's called the strategic approach. It's also termed the rational choice approach or the instrumental model. According to this approach, every interaction between actors is viewed as a game in which all the actors try to accomplish the political goals. So every interaction in that sense, the terror organization versus the government are viewed as two different actors who try to promote their political goals, and their interaction is standing within the context of a game. We talked about game theory and all those strategic interactions. So this is more prevalent for scholars who adopt this approach. One of the main benefits of the strategic approach is its parsimony, it's its simplicity. It's based on a very simple set of assumptions. I'm going to talk about that in a second. It can be generalized. So again, you see a lot of similarity between this approach when it comes to terrorism to the rational choice model overall, trying to base it on a very simple interpretation of behavior and trying to generalize that to all modes of behavior. So in this case, we're using an approach which focuses on terrorism incidents and explain the motivations for terrorism, but we're trying to extend that not for specific types of individuals or groups, but to all types of terrorism in this case. According to the strategic approach, terrorism views the choice to engage in terrorism as a calculated choice based on very specific objectives. Those who engage in terrorism try to accomplish very certain goals while minimizing their cost, which means, by definition, when we think about the rational choice model, the terrorism is a rational choice. You have an objective, you're trying to accomplish that objective, and you're trying to minimize the cost, so having the highest net benefit by accomplishing that goal. And that, by design, that's the idea of a rational choice, which is very different. And I'm going to give you an example in a few minutes to talk about this whole idea of terrorism as a rational choice. But this is what this approach promotes, viewing this kind of behavior as a rational decision by those who decide to take part of it. All right, so let's talk about assumptions. That's what makes this approach very simplistic in a way. Actions are always directed at others, which means that the outcomes of actions, in this case terrorism, are a function of strategic interactions among multiple actors. Each actor in this case, when makes a decision to act on some level, will also contemplate the objectives or the preferences of the others. So when the terror organization decides to engage in some kind of an attack somewhere, it will also take under consideration how is the target, in this case, the government or the public, are likely to respond. That's part of the strategic logic of it, which also I talked about it when I talked about the rational choice model. Using again the rational choice model, a lot of the basic assumptions of that theory also takes place here. I wrote it here as rational choice preferences, but it actually has 3 different assumptions, which I've already mentioned when I talked about the rational choice model overall. The first is that we accept the fact that decision makers have preferences and we don't care where those preferences come from. We just accept it. The second assumption when it comes to rational choice is that there is some order to those preferences. So if we have 3 different outcomes that we prefer, there's A, B, and C. So this is the order of those preferences. And the last one is called for the fact that preferences are what's called transitive, which means if I prefer outcome A over B and I prefer outcome B over C, I will also prefer outcome A over C. That's what's called transitive. And if you follow those kinds of assumptions in your decisions, in your behavior, that's a rational behavior. The last assumption of this approach is the unitary actor, which means we view all terror organizations or individuals as a single actor. Similarly, we have the unitary actor approach to the way that states behave. And some intuitions to that, if we look at, those are just, headlines from large media outlets. In this case, ISIS in Europe could launch attack. It's not operatives within ISIS. It's not the terror group ISIS. It's describing ISIS as a single actor. And that's where it makes sense to us. It doesn't seem to us very odd to think about it this way. All right, so how does these simple assumptions lead to certain implications? All right, so the first implication is that actors will evaluate the expected response of their adversaries before engaging in some kind of attack. So for that matter, terrorists will calculate the expected responses of their rival to different types of attacks. And those calculations will take place before an attack begins. So as an example, it's not really a clear example for this specific point, but what I want to show you, this is a quote by bin Laden. I'll stop the sharing of this for a minute and I will share something else with you. There it is. This is a quote by bin Laden from way back in 2004. And what he says here essentially is that all that Al-Qaeda has to do is to send a couple of their fighters to the East Point, a piece of cloth which says Al-Qaeda, and that's going to make the American general to race there and cause a lot of suffer and human and economic losses. So essentially what that shows us is a very strategic type of thinking, because what he says, all we have to do is to send someone over there, and I know how the Americans are going to respond. So that's a very strategic way to think about the implementation of terrorism. Now, let's go back again to our slides. So this is one implication. Another one is what's called coercive effectiveness, and that's the ability of terrorists to force their adversaries into making concessions, so they will maximize their return on their preferences. So they will get the maximum outcome based on what do they do. In that sense, if a terror organization plants a bomb and explodes a bomb in the middle of Times Square, they're actually telling the American public, we're willing to pay a cost and you will pay a cost in order for us to get our political objective, whatever that objective is, it doesn't matter for us, right? The third point, the third type of implication is what's called substitution. And that's the change in methods or the change in locations. And that's also based on some of the arguments from the rational choice model, which suggests that rational decision makers will engage in actions. They will get feedback from the environment and learn whether their actions are successful or not. And if they're not successful, if the evidence suggests that their actions are not effective, they should change their behavior. So in that sense, that's what leads to substitution by terror groups. So for example, terror groups learned pretty early on, you see here in the 1950s, the change from using perpetrators only men, maybe it's going to be also more effective to use women as perpetrators. And that started way back in the Algerian War in the 1950s. And that was actually a pretty prevalent method of terrorism for the Palestinian terror groups during the Second Intifada. Another shift in this case, or change or substitution, is a substitution in location. So many attacks in the past were focused on Western Europe in the 1980s and 1990s, and then we had the attacks in the United States. But because the evidence from the environment told terrorists that during the 2000s, there was a lot more fortification of targets in the United States and Western Europe, so they engage in substitution and shifts the focus on their attacks from Western Europe, the United States, and other countries in the West to a lot of countries that are in Africa, in South Asia, and the Middle East. This is a substitution in location. The last one is another example of substitution in methods. And what you see here is the change in the most prevalent method used by Palestinian terror groups led by Hamas. So the bold line is the suicide attacks. And you can see that the number of attacks, of suicide attacks, has dropped substantially, in the middle of 2000. And what happened at the same time, that a different method was adopted. The use of rocket launches has increased over that time. So once suicide attacks became inefficient method to achieve their political goals for those groups, they have just substituted that to a different method and engaged in the use of rocket launches. And this is a pretty clear example for substitution. Right now, in terms of criticism, because no theory, of course, provides us a perfect explanation, in reality, terror groups are not unitary. They are not monolithic. Instead, they consist of multiple members, and because they consist of those different members, they suffer from the same organizational challenges and problems when it involves management issues and internal conflicts. So it's problematic to describe terror organizations as a unitary actor and view it and study them in that way. A second point of criticism which is raised against this approach is that terrorism is not an effective nature. If we follow the rational model in this case, if terrorism is not effective, then terrorism should stop. But terrorism persists even though it's ineffective. And how do we know that? Because there's evidence on studies that conducted all kinds of data-based evidence to show that terrorism is actually one of the least successful modes of contention compared to, for example, nonviolent contention is a lot more effective in accomplishing political objectives compared to terrorism. Also more, outside of these specific contexts of studies that explore incidents and data, in many cases, terrorism leads to population backlash and actually increased support to the government. Instead of terrorism causing the public to pressure the government to concede to the demands of the terrorists, it actually leads to the opposite outcome. And the public supports the government and keep on countering the terrorists themselves, which we're going to talk also a little bit more on Thursday. This is just another version of the rally around the flag effect, which I've already mentioned numerous times in the past couple of weeks. The third point is the fact that terrorists do not necessarily learn from failures, and they persist in attacks despite lack of success. And one of the evidence for that is the fact that ever since the mid-2000s, when the Palestinian terror groups, all the groups for that matter, have turned to much more, they use a lot more the rocket launching as their main method of attacks. They kept using that method, even though from a political standpoint, they did not gain much benefit. There's not any kind of accomplishment of political objectives for those terror groups by using this same method of terrorism. The situation is pretty much in a stalemate between both sides, both from the Israeli side as well as from the Palestinian, the terrorist side, but I'm focusing now on the motivations for terrorism. They do not get the benefits they want from using this kind of method, but they still persist in using them. And that's the criticism in this case. But the question that we can ask in this context is, how can we account for some of these problems of this approach? And for that, I'm going to give you one option here, is what if we think about terrorism from an organizational standpoint, right? Because in a lot of cases, these are terror organizations to do that. And that's the organizational approach. It adopts a social perspective on terrorism, focusing on the inner works of organizations and their interactions with other groups. One of the main distinctions of this approach from the strategic approach, and I'm going to raise a few more distinctions as we go along in the remaining time that we have for today, is that the main objectives, according to the organizational approach, is the organizational survival. And terrorism in this case is not the objective, it's just a tactical innovation intended to ensure this. So we'll talk about the assumptions and break those arguments while we're talking about that. So again, the primary assumption in this case is the organizational survival stands above all as an objective for groups. It's not a political goal, it's not a strategic goal. All actions that terror organizations are engaging in are intended to secure the survival of the group, whether it is the recruitment, whether it is accumulating public support, getting as much media coverage as possible or financial support. All those actions are only intended to secure the survival of the terror group. Another way in which this approach is distinct from the strategic approach is that it does not view the terrorist organizations as a unitary actor. Instead, those are fragmented groups which have multiple disagreements over the objectives of the groups, of the method that they have to use in order to accomplish those groups. As an example, in the late 1960s, there was a non-violent left-wing group that emerged here in the United States. It was called the SDS. It is the Student Democratic Society, and their main objectives were to fight for workers' rights and end of racism at the time. Now, in late 1969, one more radical group within that overall SDS group that disagreed with the many of the objectives of that group has splintered and caused and established the group that was called later the Weather Underground. They were much more radical, and they engaged in a much more radical action. They hoped that what they did mostly is conducting attacks on empty government installations, in the hope that that's going to lead to a mass popular insurrection. So again, this is just an example to show that groups are not unitary actors. There's a lot of disagreement, which can lead to the splintering of groups. The third, as a non-unitary group, which involve a lot of internal fragmenting, they suffer from internal conflicts, a state of constant instability, and the leaders of those groups should always be on the lookout for internal collapse or internal challenges. This is some of the assumptions. What are these assumptions tell us about how is that going to affect terrorism overall? If we think about it again from an organizational standpoint. So here are some of the implications. There's a lot more actually in the textbook that I'm using, but I just kept those for focusing on some of them. When the environment, the organizational environment is dense, which means there's a lot of groups operating at the same time, there will be more terror attacks. That's one implication. Why? Because there's a lot of competitions, and groups are competing with one another on being the primary group, being the most powerful group, being the most famous group. So they engage in some form of outbidding behavior. So one group is going to try and detonate a bomb in the middle of the public place, causing 15 casualties, and another group is going to up the ante and put a bigger bomb in the middle of a public place and create 50 casualties. Why? Because that's going to make this group the most powerful group. It's going to allow that group to attract more recruits, more financial support. All of that based on the number one objective for terrorism, for terror groups, according to this approach, I'll remind you again, and that's the survival of the group. So the more dense the environment is, the more likely it is that we're going to have a lot more attacks. As an example, you can think about Israel during the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. A lot of groups operated in the very small space of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and the number of attacks was very, very high. A second implication is that groups will target rivals, of course, but they will also target their competitors. Again, for the same reason that I talked about earlier, all those groups are fighting over the same resources. All those Palestinian terrorist groups fought over the same recruits, over the same influence within the population, over the same extent of support and financial support. So they will not only target their rivals, which makes sense, they will actually target also other competitors. So there's a lot of infighting between groups who come from the same place and actually operate at the same place. The third point, and that again comes back to some of the distinctions with the strategic approach, groups will sustain tactics which are ineffective. Why? Here we have two reasons for that. One, because this is their calling card. For example, in this case, Hamas was the first actually organizations which started to use the rocket launches. And now it's prevalent among all the Palestinian terror groups, but it's one of the first. And even though as I said, when I talked about the strategic approach, it's not a very effective tactic in order to accomplish the political goal, they keep using that because this was their calling card. This is how they stood out as a terror organization, promoting the political objectives of Palestinian independence at the time. The second reason for sustaining that from an organizational standpoint is what can be viewed as a transaction cost. Groups invest a lot of resources in terms of money, in terms of training, in terms of personnel, in order to master some kind of method, whether it is suicide bombing, whether it is the use of rocket, whether it is the use of kidnapping, whatever that method is, groups invest a lot of resources in that. If now they have to change for a different tactic because it's, from a rational standpoint, ineffective, they have to accumulate a lot of those transaction costs. And from an organizational standpoint, it makes less sense because the objective is not some political objective. The objective is the survival of the organization. Okay. Another implication is that recruitment or people join the terror group not because of some abstract or very wide-scale political objectives, but because of the social benefits of the group. Studies that has been done in the Middle East on many of the terror groups that relate to ISIS or Al-Qaeda in Syria over the last couple of years, it's shown that many of the recruits to those groups joined because of those social benefits, of being part of something that they see as something important, not necessarily from a political standpoint. A lot of these recruits joined because other members of their town or their village were members of the terror groups. Some joined because members of their family were in that group. So it's mostly a social process which leads to recruitment into the terror organizations and not a political process. And that's one difference. Finally, the last implications in this case relate to leadership crises, which lead to an increase in violence, because those are phases of instability and different factions within the group try to take over, so they will engage in more radical behavior. And what you have here, and leadership crisis is mostly, in many cases, associated with the counterterrorism policy of what's called target killing or decapitation of leaders. The logic behind that method, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more on Thursday, is that, you know, it's the idea that's called let's kill the head of the snake so we can kill the group. But in many cases, what happens if we think about it from an organizational standpoint is there's no leadership to the group. So a lot of the more radical factions within the group will try to take over. So we'll actually engage in a lot more severe types of attacks. And that's exactly what this research, we tested Israel's targeted killing policy, has shown. The more leaders are killed, and you see the number here, what you have here on the y-axis is the predicted attacks against military targets. So there's less attacks against military targets, the more there are killing of leaders. But at the same time, the number of attacks do increase. And the more attacks on leaders, the more strikes that there are against leaders of terror organizations, there's actually more attacks on civilian targets. So those two figures together tells us that the more the policy of targeted killings is being implemented, it creates those leadership crises, and that actually lead to an increase in violence against the public. So that's another implication based on those organizational level logic. All right, some criticism. First of all, the empirical evidence regarding an outbidding behavior and the effects of competition is relatively limited, which is one argument. A much more severe criticism on this approach is what's called the indeterminate outcomes. Now, I've talked a lot over the last couple of minutes that the more competitive the environment is, the more likely it is they're going to have a lot more terror attacks. There's also a couple of other scholars which follow the organizational approach, which argue that the more terror organizations cooperate with one another, there are more attacks. And it makes sense because when they cooperate, they can share resources, they can share knowledge and skills, and that leads to more attacks. And what we have here essentially is two, in a way, contradictory mechanisms, competition and cooperation, both of them leading to the same outcome, which means, leads us to the question that you have here at the bottom of the slide: how can we falsify that theory? If showing evidence for more competition leads to more attacks, but also showing evidence that more cooperation, which also means less competition, leads to more violence and more attacks, how can we show that this is not the case and provide more validity for a theory? Well, one of the solutions that some of the scholars use to overcome those problems is to look a little bit more specifically, for example, in cooperation within specific regime or specific types of organizations, big organizations, small organizations, those kinds of aspects. So by going even deeper into unpacking organizations that engage in terrorism, we can slightly overcome some of that problem. But this is a very severe criticism which is laid out against this approach. So the organizational approach provides us with a relatively strong explanatory power, but it's still unclear. It has those points of criticism which I just talked about. In addition, it's not very clear when we follow that approach why only some individuals will mobilize and support terrorism or join groups. And even when we look within groups that engage in terrorism, we have more radical factions and we have more moderate factions. So how can we explain that? And one way to do that is to go to the individual level and follow ideologies. The idea behind a particular belief system as the motivation to join terrorism or to engage in terrorism. Now, before we go even to that, we have to define ideology, which is a very challenging aspect because there's a lot of points or a lot of different arguments to define what is ideology. And in this kind of a scenario, it's relatively easy if we want to study terrorism, in this case, based on different ideologies, to just we call this as recruiting ideology to support a politically driven argument. And that's one of the reasons that when researchers study terrorism, they tend to resist from classifying terror groups by their ideologies. Nevertheless, ideology is still extreme, especially extreme ideology, is still a central part or central motivating factors for groups that engage in terrorism. So we still need to study that, but it's still a complicated one. And the main question that we address when it comes to this approach is how does a certain belief system regulates and motivates behavior? So terrorism becomes an accepted form of behavior. Before we go into the specifics of this approach, I want to just get you a quick 3-4 minutes review on different types of ideologies. Separated by different categories, we can think about secular and religious ones. So beginning with secular ideologies, this is actually, maybe surprisingly to some of us, the more prevalent type of ideologies of terrorism over the last 150 years. And there's a lot of different examples. I'm just going to talk about some of them now. So the first is what's called the Marxism extremist. It has been prevalent in the 20th century. It's based on Karl Marx philosophy and the call for revolution by those who were exploited by a social system. The violence, according to this approach, is a tool that groups use to change the existing order. And that, again, this is similar to the argument, to the call by Marx for the revolution by the workers in order to take control over the means of production and then change the system. Many of the groups that follow the Marxism approach have originated from the adoption of a different version of Marxism by the Soviet Union in the second half of the 20th century. And a lot of those groups operated in Eastern and Western Europe during the 1970s and 1980s. A different secular ideology is what's called the fascism ideology or the supremacist extremism. This approach espouses military citizenry, which is controlled by a powerful authoritarian leader. It tends to glorify violence and masculinity and racial supremacy. So within society, there's a natural hierarchy when some groups are more dominant than others. Research has shown that groups that adopt this kind of ideologies tend to be a lot more violent compared to, for example, a left-wing Marxist types of views. Now, secular ideologies are not just social order-based. Some of them are also filling to what's called the national separatist ideologies. Those have emerged mostly as a post-colonial ideologies. Individuals that were freed from the control of colonial power. It is viewed as the struggle for securing the right of self-determination for those individuals, and the violence, according to those ideologies, is intended to redeem the oppressed from the control of their colonial powers. Some of the groups that have used this ideology include, for example, ETA, which was the Basque group operating in the north of Spain since the late 1950s, fighting for the independence of the Basque people in the north of Spain and the south of France. And the second one is the second example is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is, again, it's a secular terror organization which operated in the West Bank and Israel. It's actually operational until today, but it's a lot less powerful right away. The idea behind it, again, was more of a nationalist call for the independence of the Palestinian people. The second category is the more famous one, different religious ideologies. I'm not going to talk about that for more than a minute or two because I can spend a whole class or two just talking about that. We're mostly familiar with the radical Islamic ideology, which is based on the moral belief in the need to eliminate all those who are outside of the specific radical interpretation of Islam. A Christian extremist religious ideology is also similar to the fascist or the white supremacist ideology, believes in that certain races are more worthy than others within society. But in this case, this is a view that is based on religious texts. So there was a group in the late 1970s called the Turner Diaries, which viewed its dominance, the dominance of the white race compared to other types of races, and also opposed the American government. It was also anti-Semitic and all that, and anti-gays. That was some of the views espoused by that group. Timothy McVeigh, which was the perpetrator of the attack in Oklahoma City in 1995, was a loose follower of this kind of a view. But there's not direct evidence for the fact that he was a Christian extremist. He just has some kind of a connection, very loose connection to those kinds of ideologies. And finally, and not to undone, let's not forget about Jewish extremism. So the Kach movement was the movement that advanced a very radical interpretation of the Bible and the way that Israel should be run on some level. It advanced the doctrine of turning Israel into a theocracy and viewed all Arab as enemies, because everyone who was outside of this belief system was an enemy. It led to some of the more extreme, violent incidents when it revolves to terrorism originating from Israeli perpetrators. So in February 1994, Dr. Baruch Goldstein went into the cave of the Patriarch in Hebron and massacred almost 30 Palestinians who were praying at the time. It led to a wave of violence over the next couple of months, a lot of civilian casualties in Israel. And not long after that, in November of 1995, which is now we actually mark about 25 years to that, a young law student that was also a follower of that belief system has assassinated former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was at that time engaged in negotiations with the Palestinians, because the murderer at the time believed that those kinds of negotiations involve a violation of those views. So those are just different types of ideologies. The main assumptions of the ideological approach: unlike the strategic approach, we care about the origins of preferences. We want to understand what belief system will justify the use of violence, making terrorism a desirable behavior. At the same time, we care less about the unit of analysis that can be an ideology of an individual or a group. It does not really matter. The third point is how beliefs translate to a more radical approach or to radicalization process for individuals and groups. And that's whether the belief is part of a more, describes the struggle as a cosmic struggle, a collective struggle, which requires human sacrifice. It places a lot more emphasis on the role of the afterlife. And in many cases, a belief system which requires to satisfy a supernatural authority means that the group are more likely to move into a more radicalization process. Before I go into the implication part of the discussion for this approach, I'll stop for today's attendance word. So for today attendance word is the word triangle. Triangle is attendance word for today. What are the implications? What are the central implications of the ideological approach? First, extreme belief is more likely to motivate more extreme violence. So in here, we can separate between the secular ideology and the religious ideology. For the secular ideology, the audience for those groups is mostly the public, and the objective is to correct society. So we engage in those violent actions in order to mobilize members of the public to follow the terror group and to change society. On the other hand, the religious groups, their audience is usually a supernatural. So their audience is usually some kind of the belief in God or whatever that may be. And they're calling for a complete overhaul of the system. So the target for the religious ideology groups are all non-believers. And that means at the end of the day is that groups that follow a religious ideology are more likely to be a lot more deadly than groups who just follow a secular ideology. Again, because of that different interpretation of the extreme belief and how that translates to violence. Another implications is talking about strategic behavior, which is counterproductive. So engaging in different acts of violence or terrorism is based on the ideological beliefs and not on a strategic calculation. As an example, ISIS has engaged in multiple attacks on a certain village in Syria, and ISIS has accumulated a lot of losses and casualties trying to take control of that area. And the main reasons that they were focusing so much on that territory was their interpretation, a very certain interpretation that members of ISIS had to attacks by the Prophet regarding that area in Syria. So because of the way that they believed in the way that the Prophet discussed that area, they placed a lot of emphasis on that, and they were willing to suffer a lot of cost, which is counterproductive from a rational utility standpoint. Another example is that in many places in Syria and northern Iraq where ISIS has took control, they have banned the act of smoking. which is very prevalent among some members of the Arab society, and led to a lot of public resentment to those ISIS groups. So even though the ISIS needed the support of the public at that time, they were unwilling to compromise, and they wanted the public to follow the rules. So this is, in a way, from a strategic standpoint, this is counterproductive. The third implication is the idea of violence for its own sake. So there's evidence from a Shiite terrorist from Lebanon that suggests that they argued that their goal in implementing the violence in the form of terrorism is not to accomplish some kind of political objectives or to accumulate public support for their goals. It's to serve God by committing those kinds of acts. So that means that the violence in this case is not a tool for some kind of political objectives or even organizational objective for that matter. It's violence for the sake of violence. And that's one of the implications of following those kinds of extreme belief systems. Finally, let's talk about criticism. So the first one is a very common one when it comes to research overall. Correlation is not causation. I'm not going to talk about it more than a few seconds because we don't have time. I already talked for more than an hour. But for our purposes, the fact that some individual or some group believe in some kind of ideology, does that provide us evidence that this is the cause for the violence? It's hard to show that. And that leads to the second point we have here, which is ideology cannot be observed. How can we classify ideologies, right? Even if some individual engages in terrorism and then argues that he did that in the face on some kind of a religious or secular ideology, it's not very clear for us that this is actually the reasons for that, right? In addition, there are a lot of terror groups which actually follow a lot of ideologies. Hamas, for example, is both a radical religious ideology, follows a radical religious ideology, as well as a secular nationalist separatist ideology. So which one of those two is the motivation for their attacks? It's hard to know. And that leads to the third point. Is ideology actually the driver or the motivation for terrorism, or is just justification after the fact? So if an individual has planted an explosive device in the middle of, I don't know, downtown College Station, if he was apprehended, the bomb actually exploded and there was a lot of casualties. When this individual is being interrogated, he decides that he's going to say that he did that in order to promote some kind of religious ideology or secular ideology, whatever that may be. Is that because that was the motivation in the first place, or he just decided to adopt that after the fact as a post hoc justification for the act? And the motivation was completely different. It's very hard to show that. Finally, if we are accepting the arguments made by this ideological approach to explain the motivations for terrorism, then the policy solutions for terrorism are highly immoral. It may mean that we need to accept policy solutions such as profiling of individuals. So those who follow a right-wing interpretation of society, such as the fascist interpretation, will be profiled, and they will be stopped by police, or they will be stopped at the airport. Muslims are more likely to be stopped by police or the airports. Jewish, Christian, whatever that is, it doesn't matter. And I don't want to talk about specific ideologies. But if we are following this approach, that means that we are classifying individuals based on their belief system, and that is part of our national security strategy, which is problematic. It has a lot of aspect when it comes to violation of moral norms, because we apprehend, or we follow, we surveillance individuals based on their belief system, which is a problematic one because we don't necessarily have the evidence that that's the cause for them being the suspects, yes or no. All right, so this is the discussion for today. It was a little bit long, and I apologize for that, but this is a very big topic, and I tried to give you a lot of sense about that. There's a lot more ways we can talk about terrorism. On Thursday, I'm going to talk about a few other aspects of terrorism, talking mostly about the effects of terrorism and the counterterrorism tools that we have. And that's it. If you have, as I said early on, if you have other things you want to talk about regarding the final project, then please come talk to me during office hours. Send me an email. Don't get stuck when you're trying to write that down and feel like you are alone in this. I can try and help you as much as I can. With that, I will see you on Thursday, and see you, everyone.